Hello and welcome. In this episode of 0 to 40K, we're painting Typhus. This is the most complicated, intricate model that I've worked on to date. This is going to be the warlord of my army someday, so I'm taking this one pretty seriously. You'll note from the title that there's some glitter involved later on, and we'll definitely get to that. A lot of you will probably also note, and a friend pointed out from an early photo, that I put this model together whole before painting. I probably should have left the bugs and all the warp stuff off the back, but in for a penny, in for a pound, I'm just going to deal with it and consider it a learning experience. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Typhus as a character, he's a pretty bad dude. There's nothing really all that likable about him. I love him as a character, but he's routinely described as, of a bellicose mood. He's pretty brutal when, as a captain, when he takes the Death Guard into combat. Like he revels in it. He's also a psyker, a very powerful one. And by this point, in the 40K universe, when he is this thing you're staring at with this hive sticking out of his back and this big bloated belly, 'cause he's basically a walking chaos bug hive. He's just like, when he shows up, people scramble. He doesn't get along with Mortarion. Typhus is often out on his own, just spreading plagues to planets, while Mortarion tends to have more personal agendas or just sits around brooding. And Typhus stands up to Mortarion, argues with him, routinely has to remind him that at the end of the day, they work for Nurgle, and you can't just run off and do your own thing. So he's a pretty interesting character in that regard. I think one of my favorite parts about what I've read so far about Typhus in the books is that he's not tremendously conflicted. He knows what he's about. He actively seeks out the power that chaos can give him. He's kind of all in. Like he's the real deal. He doesn't have this Anakin Skywalker moment where it's like, oh, I'm going to turn to the dark side. Like he's been waiting for it. What he wants is massive amounts of power, and he's willing to trade away, physical appearance and being on the good guy's side. Like he and Erebus were both like born to join chaos, and so they both end up, Erebus obviously primarily, but Typhus definitely helping, being instrumental in pushing different legions little step by little step towards chaos. They do this through a system of lodges, which are like fraternal orders off the books in a bunch of different legions where Space Marines meet up, and it's very ritualized, but it's not supposed to be religious because the Emperor doesn't like that, but they all kind of wear hooded cloaks and have to say very special things, and they all have a special coin on them. It's all this insidious stuff, and Typhus is there from the beginning. His end game is to become as powerful as he can, and it's very interesting because so many of the Space Marines have a certain level of conflict of should they follow the Emperor, should they follow Horus once he turns, and Typhus is just like, yo, let's do this. In terms of 10th edition rules, my entry point to playing my first game is going to be the combat patrol that I bought. So Typhus will be a part of that, and he'll be leading a bunch of poxwalkers. I think he gets 10 of them in the combat patrol rules. And then hopefully as my army gets bigger, I can keep using him maybe with 20 poxwalkers. He makes for an interesting combination. He's got that Man Reaper scythe, which is pretty gnarly in melee. He also has a psychic attack that can do a lot of damage, and when he's paired up with poxwalkers, the damage he does with his psychic attack can also bring back more poxwalkers. So I'm hoping they'll operate as some sort of super slow meat shield for him. But it should be fun. I'm going to learn a lot. I mean, he's a very profound leader, and putting him with a bunch of chaff units should teach me a lot about, getting a mob of little miniatures across the board at the slowest pace ever. Getting back to the paint, yeah, we're starting to get some washes in here and getting some shading, and this is always the point in the process where I start feeling a little better about myself. This is some Seraphim Sepia, which I always use over the white parts of the armor. And it just starts giving it character and depth. And I love using washes because they sort of start out looking one way, but they find all the pigment finds its way into the recesses really nicely. And so after it dries, after I sit and wait, it seems like forever to go on to the next step, it looks really interesting because it feels sloppy. And doing washes like this on large parts of the model, it's a little bit sloppy. Eventually later on, you'll see me sort of dab in some darker washes in some tiny little spots. But it's just really cool, like the material properties of this super thin paint, finding every little nook and cranny on its own. You can see here, yeah, it's got a little lord on his side, so you get to do a little bit of contrast color here, which would be nice. I just love this model. There's so many things going on. He's got little bits of chain, he's got the tubes, he's got the little lord, or Nurgling, I guess in this case. The Man Reaper Scythe, has the opportunity to put some Typhus corrosion on him. He just has a lot of cool stuff. And then once you get around to the backside of him with all the bugs and plague energy, there's just a lot of different... I found myself going to a lot of different paints on this guy. And for as drab as a lot of the model is, you really get to try a bunch of different things. Here you can see, yeah, it's time for the dark wash. I think I'm using the Viejo Black here. And this is more a case where I'm just sort of dabbing it in. You're being a little bit more surgical. You get some on the brush, and all you have to do is touch the surface of the model, and the wash just sort of jumps into crevices and things. And so you get around little bolts and little cracks and things, and you don't need much of it to really get a lot of depth and texture. It's an interesting ride. I go back and I look at my earliest work, which is the point of recording it all, and I find that this sort of step of really just dabbing in tiny amounts of wash to get texture, it's one of those things that, I wish I knew that at the beginning, and I probably will go back and hit my Poxwalkers up with a little bit, but it's definitely one of those things where over time you're just constantly learning and adding stuff to your toolbox. I think the road to chaos for me began when I decided to paint a plague burst crawler so it looked like it was made out of steak. So at this point, pulling out a bunch of glitter to put on a model of one of the most vile, cruel characters in the 40k universe, no big deal. I've embraced chaos. I'm living in the warp, and I'm just going to go for it. So my plan here is, I could have used glue or something like that, but I didn't want anything that was going to be lumpy and remove all... Yeah, look at that. Gets everywhere. They're not joking. I ended up paying for this down the road. The amount of cleanup I had to do after filming this was insane. But anyhow, I didn't want to use glue or any thick medium to get the glitter on, because I didn't want to lose the texture of all the bugs and things like that. So... I started with some contrast medium, and I'm going to use washes, and then I'm going to try to add glitter enough to the point where it's dispersed enough in there, but sort of gently paints on. And the hope is that not unlike just using a standard wash, I can sort of dab this in there and get some of the glitter on and get it to stick enough to just dry out and hold. I'll eventually have to varnish this because I don't want to be that guy at the table whose passion project of Sparkle Typhus gets glitter on everyone else's stuff, so it does need to get sealed in eventually, but I just need it to stick in there enough and hold to get to that point. Now, you'll note that when I think it was Runefang Steel, when I grabbed the metallic paint to give it some baseline sheen, I specifically scraped a bunch of the thicker glop out of the pot, because I want as much of that metallic in there so that at a baseline, even regardless of the glitter, what's holding it on the model has its own natural sheen. This part is totally annoying mixing this stuff up. I'm not sure how I would improve on this, but it didn't really want to mix well. So I just kind of keep going and powering through it. So pretty soon I'm going to start adding some color to this base before I even add the glitter. It's going to be, I think they're both Viejo washes, but I want to get to something as a base that is purple, so I'm just going to use some blue wash on one side. And I'll eventually drop in some red on the other. The main reason I went with these Viejo ones is because they come in squeeze bottles. Literally at this point I was getting tired of using a little dipstick to try to pull paint out. And I definitely didn't want to pour washes from Citadel pots because I've already been challenged a bit with that in the past. And once again, I'm using washes because I want to keep this relatively thin. That's the other reason I used contrast medium as a base as well. Yeah, here we go. This part's so terrifying. God, I can barely watch it. This whole time, I'm like, sure, why not? As the glitter keeps getting on my hands, on my workspace, I'm just keeping my eyes on the future of chaos and hoping this eventually makes sense. Alrighty, Fear's the Mind Killer. We're doing this. The mix is pretty good right now. There's a decent amount of glitter in it. And as you can see, as I'm putting it on, the actual background color is light, but I'm planning on doing a wash over this to get it a little bit more purple as we go. But you can see even from my shoddy camera work that the sparkles are coming through, which is rad. So this warpish part of it will end up like purple with a bunch of different color glitter bits in it. It'll take more than one coat. I basically have to pick up the pieces of glitter on the end of the brush and then dab them in because this is mostly wash. But nicely, it is in fact, it's pretty flat because this is mostly contrast medium and wash, so it isn't removing all the texture. Obviously, this is super scary having to like reach through that Man Reaper scythe and not get the glitter on it, but it is working out. For the bugs part of this whole back piece, my original thought was I'll just take some black wash and some gold glitter and see how that sticks. And this was a little bit of trial and error. It didn't quite come together as cool as I thought it would. But I definitely, I was like, all right, well, it took a lot of additions of glitter to get enough in there. The first time I would just start dumping it in there and call it a day. If you've seen some of my other videos, the later at night this sort of session gets, the more brazen I get with my decisions. But basically, it wasn't quite working. It needed something a little thicker and shinier in it. So then I decided, I think I grabbed it right here. It's brass, maybe? Come on, camera shot. So much decisiveness. I think that's Retributor armor. Yeah, it is. So I dump some of this in, and you'll see immediately as I start mixing it that it changes the entire sort of tone of this mix. When I started painting this on, this felt a lot better, but as I've said many times, you gotta sort of paint and then let things dry a bit, sometimes dry overnight, and then see how you feel about it later. So moving on, I'll get back to those bugs in a bit, but at this point I'm moving on to detail work. I absolutely fret over eyes, eye slits, visor things. My hands tend to shake a bit, but conveniently, like on this Typhus model, those like eye slits are exactly the size of one of my brushes. So all I kind of had to do was just dab this neon paint in there, and it really stands out, and I really like it in there, and I didn't screw it up, which certainly is nice. I find that on Death Guard especially, the eye visors and the helmets, sometimes they're just straight up helmetless heads, sometimes the little googly eyes. They really are a great opportunity to use some louder colors that really stand out. And here I'm just continuing on in other spots to get some pops of color. There's the tongue on the Nurgling. I'm not even sure if I get it on camera, but there is some cloth work that'll get the same red treatment. Just so that everything isn't this drab green and sort of tan sepia thing. And then obviously, Typhus doesn't have too many exposed boils and gross things, but I'm getting some mixed yellow and green in there, just so those pop a little bit. And it just helps to keep the overall look of the model having some like unique little spots that draw the eye. Onto one of my favorite parts, we're going to add some corrosion, some Typhus corrosion. That's right, the guy is so cool, he gets his own paint. We're going to add some of this to the Man Reaper blade. You're also going to notice that the model looks a little bit darker right now. That's because I ran outside and varnished it a bit to keep the glitter stuck on and sort of add some protection. And I had to hit the whole body of the model. I think I avoided some of the Man Reaper, but it's a big spray can. And I knew that was going to tamp the color down a little bit. I found that matte varnish always does that. You can see that the back is still sparkly. But right here, I'm basically making this Reaper look like it has just been through the business. Like it's been hanging out for 10,000 years, which it has. And then we get some Rise of Rust to sort of finish the effect. I'm dry brushing. I basically just have a piece of craft board that I always just use to dry off my dry brush, because you can go in several different swirls and see how dry it's getting. Good job keeping that in the camera shot, sir. Hopefully I'll pull it back in a second. But basically I'm just dabbing it a little bit across the edges to start. And then doing the classic sort of technique where you're only really hitting you're most hitting the parts that have the most elevation. So the little recessed areas, little like divots in there don't get as much, but the edges definitely do, and it's all dependent on the angle that you're sort of swinging the brush back and forth with. I have a couple bigger dry brushes, but this thing's pretty detailed and tiny, so I went with my classic Citadel one, which is, it's good if you lay it on as heavy as I do. I'm not sure I would use the same brush to like dry brush an entire model. We're getting into the home stretch here. You can see that the purple parts are a little darker. I did hit those off camera with a couple light coats, thinned out Magos purple, which darkened those up nicely. And now right now here I'm using Viejo black and some Warp Lock bronze to darken up the bugs just a little bit. It's mostly that black wash, but the Warp Lock bronze is a nice dark metallic, and so it's bringing some of that bright yellow that my buddy pointed out when I showed a progress picture. It's bringing that down a notch, so it's a little bit more in line with the rest of the colors that I've chosen, and I'll just straight up, I mean, it's less yellow, which is good. So that was great feedback, and I always love to get great feedback, so thanks a bunch for pointing that out. Ta-da, big reveal. I'm very pleased with this guy. I definitely don't have to go back and spend another $45 to replace him. It was a bit of a journey. There's a lot of experimentation. I think if I end up with a Chaos Sorcerer or a couple other models that have a bunch of warp type stuff, I may use the same effect. It's pretty cool. I did test it out, rub my thumb all over it. The glitter's not coming off, so thank God that's true. But yeah, I'm pretty psyched about this model. I am going to be doing something special with the base sometime soon. I think the next thing I'm going to post is I got my hands on the Infernus Marines super basic set, and I'm going to try to paint that whole thing up with just the basic stuff that comes in the box and things that you can find around the house. And then I'll use one of those Ultramarines to be lying on the ground in front of Typhus. At least that's the plan. Thanks a bunch for hanging out. It's been a wild ride, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.